The role of William Dewar is often obscured in the creation of the first Bank of the United States, but of course William Dewar is Hamilton's private secretary, and he is crucial for the development of the document that's ultimately becomes the Bank of the United States document. And he, it turns out, is also holding much of the debt that was contracted during the Constitution. He's effectively a provisioner. And he becomes the nation's first millionaire once the bank is established, and it collects all the debt that was created and converts that debt into bonds, which are then issued, bonds and stocks in the Bank of the United States, which are then issued in Europe. This is somewhat familiar ground. I think the thing that also struck me though is the way in which the emerging party system, and this is a very familiar for any of you that have taught the survey, but the thing that struck me was that the Democratic Republicans, the thing that binds them together, the botanizing excursion between James Livingston in New York and Jefferson and Madison takes place, where comes right after the Bank of the United States is formed. The thing that Jefferson points out in his letters to himself, published much later, is that there wasn't a lot of support for this creation of the first Bank of the United States. There was a lot of support for the creation of the Constitution, but they left out of the Constitution the question of who would issue currency. The states can't do it. It's clear the federal government can't do it. Hamilton comes along and said, we're going to create this other institution. It's going to issue currency called the First Bank of the United States. But Jefferson notes that the people who get the initial access to the stock turn out to be half of Congress. Half of Congress is issued stock in the First Bank of the United States, many of whom get loans from the Bank of the United States so that they have the money so that they can afford to pay for the stock in the First Bank of the United States. So this is a kind of an origin story that really ticks off Jefferson. He says it's the beginning. It's a machine for the corruption of the legislature, and strict construction. You know, a story that we talk about the Virginia, Kentucky resolutions and other ways in which strict construction becomes doctrine for the Democratic Republican Party. The first case that they make for strict construction comes in this bank, their opposition to this bank. The opposition newspaper that they create, led by Philip Fourneau, constantly attacks this bank. And so in a certain sense, this conflict between this emerging Democratic Republican Party and the Federalist Party, which is increasingly aligning itself around the bank, is a conflict that creates our first two-party system. Now again, for those of you that are early Americanists, this is not news. Not a lot of people have, not a lot of living people have made this argument or paid a whole lot of attention to the Bank of the United States in this regard. But in a certain sense, one way of thinking about this conflict is that it is in fact precisely this war against the First Bank of the United States that Jackson reenacts in the 1830s. We think about Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States as being kind of on its own, but in a certain sense what Jackson is doing in his war against the Second Bank of the United States is replaying, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce, replaying this conflict. 1811 is when the First Bank of the United States ends. So it's chartered in 1791, it's given a 20-year charter, and Jefferson cannot kill this bank. He tries again and again as president to kill the Bank of the United States. He cannot get the votes in Congress to do it. But he does effectively he and the Democratic Republicans make sure that the charter is not rechartered. This bank is not rechartered. And so in 1811, the Bank of the United States goes away. It pays off all of its stockholders in full. It effectively pays off the bonds in full. This is a kind of shock in Europe. There's never been a state that has been able to pay off its debt before, and this really kind of makes a great case for the U.S. as a borrower, in that in a relatively short period it's able to pay off its debt.